Week 9, Labour Movements and Race. This week we're looking at how labour history has developed since the 19th century and how trade unions have fought for workers' rights but also have changed in response to the new types of economy after industrialisation and after deindustrialisation, and how perhaps trade unions have always been somewhat out of step with these changes. So the first thing we obviously have to think about is what is a trade union and what did they do? And the first trade unions emerged officially in the early 19th century, although arguably there had then been workers' combinations and workers' societies from at least the 17th century in the form of guilds and friendly societies. But trade unions, as we now know them, emerged during the industrial period to fight for higher wages and better working conditions. And those remain the central agenda of trade unions. But they also wanted to protect workers and protect wages and working conditions through legislation. So a lot of their pressure was put on Parliament to keep legislation that protected workers' rights or to pass more legislation. Whereas in the 19th century, the government was under pressure by employers to open up a free market, but in terms of the national economy, but also in terms of getting rid of any protective legislation. So the part of the battle that was faced in the 19th century was about fighting against this idea of free market capitalism, that the state shouldn't have any say in the way that the economy ran itself. And another part of this was a defence of skilled labour. This is a theme that we'll see throughout this lecture, is that trade unions are predominantly white, male, skilled labour. And so they fought against the employment of women and children, whom they believed would bring down wages, bring down skill. They also, in the early period, fought against the use of machinery that would also automate parts of jobs and de-skill the employment. So trade unions are very much exclusionary bodies. They excluded certain workers from what they believed to be rights because they were in defence of white male skilled labour. The history of 19th century trade unions is quite a long one, and it's also quite an established one. It's established in classic labour history. It quite often starts with the government banning trade unions in 1799-1800 with the Combination Act. And those are enforced the first quarter of a decade in the 19th century. There are certain key events and certain key people that are quite often recited at trade union histories and referred to in trade union events such as galas and celebrations. So the Tolpuddle martyrs are quite a common one, who were agricultural labourers who joined a trade union in 1834 and were transported to Australia because of it. There's the first general strike in 1842, and the beginnings of a much more organised national and international trade union movement, with the first meetings in Manchester of what eventually became the Trade Unions Council in 1868, and development, as we've seen before in the lecture on democracy, of workers starting to campaign for their own political party. So the trade unions eventually set up the Labour Representation Committee in 1900, which led to the formation of the Labour Party. And there's other key events. You can look them up for yourself. They're quite often in the chronology of events of the trade unions, such as the Taff Vale case, which was quite an important legal case relating to the rights of employers suing their workers for breaking contracts. So this is the kind of classic chronology. It continues into the 20th century with general strikes. General strike is where several unions combine to go on strike at the same time to push forward their agenda. Quite often happens during um, periods of economic depression and following wars, or at times of economic um, crash. And these are the most obvious ones, the biggest ones, which to some extent held the country to ransom, or at least disrupted major services, major communications um, at certain points in the 20th century. Um, the government's response to these big events is often negative, it's often repressive, it's often lobbied by employers to break the strikes. And so, following the 1926 general strike, Baldwin's government passed the 1927 Trades Disputes Act, which banned sympathy strikes and mass picketing. It was repealed in 1946, but was reintroduced by Margaret Thatcher pretty soon after she came into power. In 1980, that was passed and introduced in full again by a later Employment Act in 1990, which again is a longer term reaction against the big strikes of the 1980s. So that's the usual general labour history of the um, of Britain, and I won't spend too long time on that because um, it's a well trodden narrative, and in fact is representative of the traditional labour history, the historiography of the labour movements that you might see in older books on the shelves. It's chronological, it depends on focus on these white male skilled unions and the trade union council, um, quite often written from the union perspective. The older books generally have a Marxist perspective as well, so applying a class based framework to what's going on. And there's nothing wrong with this history, but it is a bit outdated and doesn't actually reflect all the history of workers and workers' rights in not just in the UK but also globally. So there's newer thinking about the labour movement that we'd like to emphasise in this module. And what about the workers who were not in a union or could not strike? Um, Other types of workers, such as women and people of other ethnicities, people of other trades that weren't unionised. And what about the more recent history of workers in a new neoliberal global economy? So a word that you'll see come up quite a lot in this module is intersectionality. There are critiques of this model and this word, but it is still used quite a lot in the studies of many of the different topics we've been studying. And intersectionality points out that there are people who are left out of the story of oppression and discrimination. It's not just a two-way and binary thing. It actually involves lots of different types of identities, lots of types of groupings, and some are more marginalised than others. And if you're part of two or more of these categories, then you're more likely to be disadvantaged and left out of history. So the first one we look at is women. And we can go back to the 19th century, and there's quite a lot of history about this, but quite often isn't actually appreciated in the standard labour history. So women don't traditionally fit in the narrative of trade unions because of the very fact that they'd quite often been excluded from big national organised trade unions. Women had been unionised and organised in the 19th century. They did have their own trade unions, but there were other types of workers and other types of trades which didn't. What became known as the sweated trades. So the kind of the lowest of the low of type of work, of very menial manual work that only women could do for very low wages. But there was a growing awareness in the later 19th century of their conditions, and journalists did exposés of the poor conditions of um, these trades and encouraged the women to combine and unionize. The most famous of which was the matchworkers' strike in 1888 in London, in the East End. The matchworkers of the Bryant and May match factory in Bow, who went out on strike because three of their colleagues had been fired. They go to a radical journalist called Annie Besant, who was one of the co-founders of a paper called The Link, where she wrote up their conditions and encouraged them to form their own union, partly because the Women's Trade Union League hadn't really accepted these unskilled workers as part of the union. Um, she took workers to Parliament and catalogued their grievances in front of the MPs. They were only on strike for 3 weeks, but the impact of the strike was much larger. It wasn't just about these particular women in the East End. It had a bigger significance beyond the locality. It came to represent the fight of um, sweated labour, and also sort of gave them a bit of power and a bit of publicity, and other women to start to challenge their conditions too. Um, but in effect, didn't really improve women's conditions that much in the later 19th, early 20th century. So the next part of the lecture, we're going to be looking at the big changes that occur after the Second World War. But there's actually not very much change in terms of other types of workers. It's the main focus of labour history for the early 20th century still remains around the big general strikes, such as those in 1919 and 1926.